Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the last of 3 nights on the Scots who built America. The legacy. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. 2 nights ago, we sat with the crossings, the ships leaving Scottish and Ulster ports, the long weeks on open water, the families who arrived at Philadelphia and turned their faces toward the mountains. Last night, the roots of it, the Highland clans and the Lowland boroughs, the clearances and the hard choices, the roads through the valleys, the cabins in the Carolina backcountry, the culture carried like a flame. And underneath all of it, that image, 2 dusks across one ocean, a Highland glen going grey in the fading light, an Appalachian hollow settling into evening, the same sky, different continents. That image holds tonight too. Tonight is the legacy, what they built when they arrived, what they left in the land and the language and the music, what survived them and what survives still. No rush, the day is already behind you. Let the spine of the night settle. The story will find you gently from here. Chapter 1. Builders and Inventors. Dunfermline, on the south shore of the Firth of Forth. A weaver's town, grey stone, purposeful streets, the great medieval abbey at its centre. In the year 1835, in a single room on Moody Street, a boy is born to a handloom weaver and his wife. His name is Andrew. His parents call him by both names, Andrew Carnegie. The cottage is small, 1 room essentially, with a loom taking up a significant part of the floor. William Carnegie works that loom. His wife Margaret manages a small grocery from the same space. There is not much money. There is considerable intelligence in that room and considerable love. Dunfermline in the 1830s still has beauty in it, if you know where to look. The abbey rises above the town, pale sandstone against the Fife sky. The Firth is not far. On clear days you can see Edinburgh across the water. Andrew would have known those views from childhood, the sense of being somewhere ancient and particular. The handloom weavers can already see what is coming. The power looms are running in other towns. The trade that William Carnegie learnt as a young man, that his father learnt before him, is being replaced faster than any individual can respond to. The skills in his hands are not wrong. The world has simply moved elsewhere. Margaret Carnegie watches this and acts. When Andrew is 13, she makes the decision. Her brother and sister are already in America in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania. There is a passage to be found if you are willing to go. She is willing. The family sells the loom. Carnegie writes about leaving Dunfermline later in his life with a directness that does not pretend the grief was small. He was a boy who had loved that town, the abbey, the streets, the boys he had run with. All of it became the past on the day the ship left the Firth of Forth and the shoreline went grey and then disappeared. This is the emigration that does not appear in the dramatic accounts, not clearance, not starvation. A family choosing to move before necessity took the choice away entirely. The grief is real and quiet. It does not announce itself. It settles in and stays. The family arrives in Allegheny in 1848. Carnegie is 13. He goes to work immediately in a cotton factory as a bobbin boy. He earns $1.20 a week. The family's survival depends partly on that amount. He does not resent this later in the telling. He calls it the education the classroom could not have given him. What he means is not the work itself, but the people around the work, the men who taught him things, the one employer who noticed he could write clearly and promoted him, a colonel in Pittsburgh who let him use his private library on Saturday afternoons, boys welcome to come and read whatever they liked. Carnegie never forgot that library. He moves to the telegraph office next, then to the Pennsylvania Railroad, then into iron, then steel. Each step is built from the previous one. He is not lucky, exactly, though luck plays its part. He is attentive. He learns the thing in front of him completely before moving to the next one. The Monongahela Valley, where Carnegie builds his mills, has a particular character. The river bends through it, wide and gray-brown. The hills on either side are not high, but they hold the valley in the same way hills hold a highland glen, the sky contained, the world made smaller and more legible. He was not unconscious of that. By the time Carnegie Steel becomes the largest producer in the world, he is already thinking about what happens after. The money is a fact, not a purpose. The purpose comes from something older, from the weaver's cottage, from the boy who understood that his father's intelligence had nowhere to go because the right door never opened. Carnegie Hall opens in New York in 1891. He builds it, the records suggest, partly because a city should have a place for music, and he had grown up in a culture where music was part of every gathering, not a luxury reserved for those who could afford a ticket to the opera. The libraries are the deeper statement. He builds 2,509 of them in communities across America and Britain and beyond. Small towns in the American interior, towns in Scotland, towns in South Africa and New Zealand. Wherever people would establish and maintain a library, he would pay to build it. The conditions are always the same. The community must provide the land and commit to funding the operation from local taxes. He will pay for the building. He will not run it for them. He wants communities to own what they have, to take responsibility for it. The parish school tradition, scaled up and made of stone. The first Carnegie Library in America opens in Braddock, Pennsylvania, in 1889. It is a few miles from the Homestead Steelworks, where Carnegie's men will later clash with striking workers in a confrontation that shadows his legacy. The history is not clean. He would not want you to pretend it was. What is true alongside the rest? He gave almost everything away. He died in 1919, having distributed the equivalent of billions in today's terms to libraries and education and peace endowments. Not from guilt, exactly, from a theory of wealth that he had held since the Bobbin Boy days and never revised. He returns to Scotland and buys Skibo Castle in Sutherland in the far north, where the landscape is the most Highland it gets. He swims in a cold pool before breakfast in the manner of a man who never lost the habits of a place with cold mornings. He receives guests there. He listens to the pipes after dinner. He is doing in Skibo what he could not do as a 13-year-old on the ship leaving Dunfermline. He is going back, not all the way. You can never go all the way back, but close enough to smell the heather and hear the water and feel, for a while, the particular weight of a place that made you. The records suggest he never entirely left Dunfermline. He built it into everything. The cottage on Moody Street and the library in Braddock and Skibo Castle are, if you look at them in the right light, the same sentence written three different ways. Edinburgh, 1847. A house at 16 South Charlotte Street in the new town, where the streets are rational and wide and the buildings are pale Georgian stone. A boy is born here. His name is Alexander. His family name is Bell. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, is a professor of elocution and the inventor of something he calls visible speech. It is a notation system that maps every sound a human being can make, showing the position of the lips and tongue and palate for each one. The family trade is voice. They think about it the way a carpenter thinks about wood. Alexander's mother, Eliza, is significantly deaf. She manages this with composure and with skill, using a rubber ear tube and an acute attention to faces. Her son learns from childhood to speak close to her forehead so that she can feel the vibration of his voice through bone conduction. He grows up knowing, in the most physical way, that sound is something you can touch. He attends the Royal High School in Edinburgh, then studies in London, then assists his father in teaching elocution. The family moves to Brantford, Ontario for his health, then to Boston, where he takes a position teaching at a school for deaf students. He is his father's son, working with voice and its mechanics always. The telephone is not a departure from this work. It is its logical conclusion. If voice is a physical thing, then it should be possible to transmit it physically along a wire. The idea has predecessors. Bell is not the only person working on it. The race is real, and the margin of his victory is narrow. The first clear, intelligible message by telephone is sent on the 10th of March, 1876. Bell is in a boarding house in Boston. His assistant Watson is in the next room. The words Bell speaks are ordinary, a request for help with something he has spilled. What matters is not the words. What matters is that they travel. Bell is 29 years old. He has been in America for 4 years. He is still, in some part of himself, the boy from Edinburgh who grew up understanding that sound has weight and the voice is a physical instrument. The telephone is what you build when you know that. He does not stop with the telephone. He keeps going in the direction his curiosity pulls him. Work on methods of teaching speech to deaf students. Experiments with flight, with kites, with the principles of aeronautics. Research into sheep breeding, into methods of desalination. He is restless in the manner of someone who sees questions everywhere and cannot leave them alone. He builds a summer laboratory at Baddeck on the Bras d'Or Lakes in Nova Scotia. The landscape there is rocky and lake-threaded, lit by a northern light that is not so different from Scottish light. He works late into the evenings, the water dark outside, the papers on his table covered in sketches and numbers. He is happy there, the records suggest. He dies in 1922 at Baddeck and is buried on the summit of a hill on his estate, looking toward the water. At the moment of his burial, all telephone service in North America is suspended for 1 minute. Every line goes quiet simultaneously in honor of the man who first made them speak. Dunbar, East Lothian, 1838, a harbour town at the edge of the North Sea. The light here is flat and cold and very clear. The ruins of Dunbar Castle stand above the shore, red stone worn to softness by centuries of sea wind. A boy named John Muir grows up scrambling those ruins. His father, Daniel, is a strict Calvinist. He believes in hard work, in scripture, and in the improving virtue of both. He makes his sons memorize long passages of the Bible, Proverbs, the Psalms, the full text of the New Testament. John later says this was among the most useful things his father gave him, not the theology, the discipline of carrying long texts inside the head. The family emigrates to Wisconsin in 1849. John is 11. They clear land near Portage, break the soil, build a farm from nothing in the way that the Scots who came before them had done in Appalachia and the Ohio Valley and everywhere else the frontier required it. The work is heavy. The winters are long. As a young man, John begins to walk, first through the Midwest, then 1,000 miles from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico, on foot, recording everything he sees in a notebook with the same painstaking attention his father gave to scripture. He is doing natural history in the way a minister does theology, completely without shortcuts. He arrives in California and reaches the Yosemite Valley for the first time in 1868. The records suggest he wept. He had been shaped by the spare beauty of an East Lothian shore and the hard geometry of a Wisconsin farm. The valley is something his vocabulary has no precedent for. He stays. Muir's writing about the Sierra Nevada is not the soft pastoral of a man who finds nature soothing. It has rigor in it, a Calvinist attention to what is actually there. He measures glaciers. He identifies the marks that ice has left on the valley walls. He asks the geological questions and goes looking for answers in the rock and in the movement of ice still present on the heights. The question of what formed Yosemite is not settled when Muir arrives. The accepted view attributes the valley's shape to a single catastrophic collapse. Muir looks at the evidence and disagrees. He argues in letters and essays and in conversations with scientists that glacial action formed it slowly over immense time. He is correct. The evidence eventually confirms him. He is, in this, recognizably Scottish. The tradition that produced him, the parish school, the kirk, the culture of reasoned argument and documentary evidence, prepared him to disagree with received opinion when the evidence was against it. He was not a credentialed scientist. He was a man who could look carefully and think clearly. He had been taught to do both. He founds the Sierra Club in 1892. He persuades leaders to expand the national park system. He argues, in print and in person, that the wilderness belongs to the public, not to the interests that wish to log it or graze it or dam it. He is making an argument that has a long history behind it, though he does not always name the history. The idea that land should be available to ordinary people, not enclosed by those with the power to do so, runs straight back through the Scots tradition. The people who watched the Highland clearances, who were pushed from ground their families had worked for generations, knew exactly what it looked like when a landscape was taken from the people who belonged to it. Muir knew too, in his bones. There are engineers whose names have not lasted as well as Carnegie's or Bell's or Muir's, but whose work is equally present in the fabric of American life. James Renwick, whose family was Scottish, designed St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York and the original Smithsonian Building in Washington. The precision of the stonework reflects a tradition that came across an ocean with his ancestors. William Sellers standardized the machine's screw thread in America in the 1860s. His grandfather had come from Scotland. The standardization of industrial components sounds dry as a subject, but it is not. Without a common thread standard, every bolt in America was made to fit one specific nut, and nothing was interchangeable. Sellers changed that, quietly, entirely, forever. The Scots ironmasters who came to Pennsylvania brought furnace techniques from the Lanarkshire and Ayrshire valleys and applied them to ores they had never smelted before. They adapted. That is the quality the record keeps returning to. Not that they imported Scotland whole, but that they took what they knew and made it work in conditions that Scotland had not prepared them for. James Watt never crossed the Atlantic. He died in Birmingham in 1819, having spent his life in Scotland and England. But his steam engine crossed without him. Every American foundry and mill that ran on steam in the 19th century was running, in some degree, on an insight that a Glasgow instrument maker had about latent heat and the separate condenser. The invention emigrated. The inventor stayed. These men were not a coordinated effort. There was no Scottish plan for America. They followed necessity or curiosity or the pull of land and work individually in separate decades by separate routes. What coherence exists between them was not organized. It emerged from a shared way of being educated, a shared habit of reasoned attention, a shared inheritance of doing things carefully and then doing them again better. Carnegie built from the memory of a weaver's cottage. Bell built from a deaf mother's face. Muir built from the ruins of a castle on a cold Scottish shore. The American things they made carry that origin in them, the way good work always carries the mark of where it came from, even when no one is looking for it. These are quiet facts, worth sitting with on a night when sleep is finding you slowly. They built things that last. They carried something across the water and set it down in new ground, and it took root. The thread from Dunfermline to Pittsburgh, from Edinburgh to Baddeck, from Dunbar to Yosemite, is real, and it holds. Rest with that for a while. Chapter 2. Why Appalachia sounds Scottish. Picture a hollow deep in the Blue Ridge. The year is 1790 and the fire is low. A woman sits near the coals spinning. She is singing. The tune is old, older than her grandmother's grandmother. It came off a ship at Charleston or Philadelphia, tucked inside memory, carried through a gap in the mountains. She does not know its name. She only knows it belongs to her. The ballads did not need to be written down. They lived in the voice. In Scotland, a song passed from mother to daughter in a single room, firelight moving on the walls, the words layered with older words beneath them. In Virginia, in Carolina, in Tennessee, the same transmission happened. The vessel changed. The cargo did not. These were not simple songs. They carried whole stories inside them. A lord on a grey horse, a woman waiting at the edge of a cliff, a brother who never comes home from the war. The plots were dark and honest in the way that old stories are honest. They did not soften death or betrayal. They named those things, and somehow the naming was a kind of comfort. The scholars who first studied them called them the Child Ballads, after Francis James Child, the 19th century Harvard professor who spent his career writing them down. Child worked from manuscript collections and from correspondence across Britain. He published 305 distinct ballads. He did not expect to find them still alive and breathing in America. His correspondence did, though. A woman in Virginia in the 1880s, writing down a song her elderly neighbor sang for her, recognized that she was not recording a fragment. She was recording something complete. The song was not corrupted or half-remembered. It was intact, note for note, verse for verse, as it had been in the Scottish borders 3 centuries before. Francis Child never visited Appalachia. He died in 1896, but the work continued after him. Cecil Sharp, an English folk song collector, came to the southern mountains in 1916 and 1917. He was not prepared for what he found. He wrote to a friend, "It is as though I had made some discovery in the natural world." Sharp traveled through the mountain counties with Maud Carpels, his colleague and assistant. They knocked on cabin doors. They asked whether anyone knew any old songs. The response, over and over, was a kitchen chair pulled up and a voice beginning, and Sharp writing as fast as he could. He collected over 500 songs in those 2 summers. Many were Scottish in origin and had survived in forms closer to the Scottish originals than anything he had heard in Britain. The mountains had kept them better than the source country had. The isolation that sometimes felt like poverty had also been a kind of protection. The ballad called Barbara Allen is a good example. In Scotland, it was known from at least the 17th century. Samuel Pepys wrote about hearing it in London in 1665. A woman hard-hearted, a young man dying for love of her, a final moment of remorse too late. The story is simple and the grief in it is real. Sharp found Barbara Allen alive in the mountains in dozens of versions. The singers did not all tell the same story in the same words. But the core was unchanged. The cruelty, the death, the red rose and the briar growing from two grave and twining together overhead. That image had crossed an ocean and 2 centuries without losing a petal. Another was the bonny banks o' Loch Lomond. The words most people know are only a fragment of a longer tradition. In the mountains, the song often arrived in variant forms, the melody recognizable, the words slightly shifted, as if the song had taken small steps on its journey and was not quite the same person it had been at the start of the road. Lord Thomas and Fair Annet, the two sisters, the lass of Rock Royal, these travelled too, each one carrying a particular quality of Scottish emotional honesty, the kind that looks clearly at suffering without flinching, does not offer false comfort, and trusts the listener to bear what is true. That quality survived the crossing and the mountains. How did the songs stay so intact? The question matters. The answer is in the way a song carries itself inside a living tradition. A written text can be copied wrongly. A song passed by singing corrects itself. The melody holds the words in place. The meter will not allow a substitution that does not scan. Music is its own kind of memory. And the singers were good. The tradition valued a good voice, a clear delivery, a singer who could hold the room. In Scotland, the travelling singers, the tinkers and the itinerant workers were often the ones who carried songs from parish to parish. Their Appalachian counterparts were the fiddle players and singers who moved from settlement to settlement, trading a song for a meal, a tune for a night's shelter. The fiddle came too, not the concert violin of drawing rooms, the fiddle of the ceilidh held slightly away from the chin, the bow doing things the sheet music never quite captures. The tunes had names that placed them firmly. Fisher's hornpipe, the wind that shakes the barley, Jenny Lind, Shady Grove, whose minor turns belong to no English tradition. They are Scottish and older. Modal scales. This is the technical thing worth understanding because it explains so much of the sound. Most of what we call Western music uses major and minor scales. Scottish music often uses something different, modes, the Dorian mode, the Mixolydian. They produce a sound that is neither quite happy nor quite sad, unresolved, ancient, perfectly suited to a story that does not end neatly. Listen to a good Appalachian fiddle tune sometime. The ornamentation, the way a single note bends before it settles, the grace notes flicked in at the start of a phrase, the way a melody circles back on itself and finds its way home from a different direction each time. These are not American inventions. They are survivals passed hand to hand, ear to ear, from the straths and glens of Scotland. The names of the tunes shifted. A reel from Perthshire became a reel with a new name somewhere in the Virginia mountains, renamed for a local landmark or a local family. But the notes stayed. The bowing pattern stayed. A musician trained in both traditions can hear the kinship immediately. It is unmistakable once you know what you are listening for. Some of the tunes changed more than others. They met other traditions in the mountains, German settlers who had also come down the Great Wagon Road, bringing their own fiddle music, African-American musicians whose tradition would eventually combine with the Scots-Irish inheritance to produce something new. The old tunes did not disappear in these encounters. They transformed. that is a different thing. The banjo arrived through the African-American tradition, already an instrument of the New World, built from a gourd and animal skin in a form that echoed West African instruments. In the mountains, it met the Scottish fiddle tradition, and the two found common ground in the modal scales and the rhythmic drive they shared. The music that came out of that meeting became what people now call Appalachian folk or old time. It has many parents. But the Scottish lineage is deep and audible. The three-finger style, the round-back fiddle tune, the particular way of handling the bow on a reel, these are traceable back through documented transmission to specific Scottish and Scots-Irish sources. The music historians have done the work. The thread is real. Now the words, not just the songs, the everyday speech. In parts of Appalachia well into the 20th century, people used words that had disappeared from standard English 300 years earlier, but were still alive in Scots. Bairn for a small child, drike for grey and miserable weather. We, used with the same warm diminutive force it has in Glasgow today. A man might speak of going to the store directly, meaning soon, not necessarily in a straight line. That is Scots. He might say I might could do that, the double modal that sounds strange in standard American English and is perfectly natural in Scots. He might describe something as right smart, meaning quite a lot, a phrase that traces cleanly to Scots and Ulster usage. The word hollow itself, the Appalachian word for a small valley between ridges, has Scottish roots. Holla is how it was sometimes pronounced, which brings it closer still to the original. The people who named these valleys used the words they had grown up with, and the words stuck. You can read the settlement on the map if you know what to look for. Linguists who studied Appalachian English in the 20th century found something they called a relic dialect, a form of speech that preserves features which have disappeared from the parent language. The mountains had kept things sealed. A valley with one road in is a valley where the speech changes slowly. What the settlers carried in 1750 was still recognizable in 1950. Not all of the survivals were words. The rhythm of Appalachian speech has a particular quality, a slight draw on certain syllables, a musical quality in the vowels. These are features of Scots and Ulster speech, preserved in the prosody of a dialect that thought of itself as entirely American and in some ways was. Language does not announce its ancestry, it simply carries it. The church carried the culture too. Presbyterian congregations in the Appalachian valleys sang the psalms in a way that still had Scotland in it. The precentor, the appointed leader of singing, would chant a phrase of the psalm alone, and then the congregation would follow. Line by line, phrase by phrase, the whole room singing together in a slow and serious way that belonged to a tradition going back to the Scottish Reformation. This practice was called lining out. It originated in Scotland and Ireland in the 17th century, in communities where not everyone could read. The precentor read and sang the line, the congregation echoed it. Literacy was not universal, but worship was. The practice ensured that no one was excluded from the singing. In the mountains, it persisted long after literacy was general, because the music itself had become the tradition. The sound of lined-out psalmody is extraordinary. Slow, irregular in the modern sense, the congregation not in strict time together, but each voice finding its own way through the phrase, harmonies arising by accident and then sustaining themselves. It sounds ancient because it is. It crossed the Atlantic and climbed into the mountain churches and stayed there, almost unchanged, for 2 centuries. The storytelling did the same as the singing. Sitting by firelight, passing a long winter evening, someone in the cabin would begin a story, not reading, telling. The old way, the way the Sinachi had done it in the Highland townships, specific, unhurried, willing to take time with a detail because the detail was the point. A red cow, a stone fence, the smell of heather in a place where there was no heather anymore. The stories held the old country in them, not as nostalgia, not as a performed grief, but as the texture of how things had been. A grandmother who had crossed the Atlantic as a girl remembered what she had left with great exactness. She could describe the burn behind the house, the way the light came across the lock in the morning, the specific weight of a peat brick in the hand. Her grandchildren had never seen these things. They saw them anyway through her. There is a particular kind of Scots irony that belongs to this tradition. Dry, understated, delivered without any change in the face. Robert Burns had it. You find it still in the mountains. The ability to say something sideways that means something else entirely, and everyone in the room knows it. This is not a learned technique. It is a tone passed down through generations of people who had learned that direct complaint could be dangerous and who preferred to make their point with a quiet joke. The ceilidh had no exact translation in the mountains, but its spirit did. After a cabin raising or a harvest, after a day of communal labor, the people who had worked together sat together in the evening. Someone brought a fiddle, someone knew a song. The children stayed up too late. The old people nodded in their chairs. The fire kept the room warm. These gatherings had no name in the mountains. They were just what you did. But their shape is the shape of the ceilidh, translated into a different landscape. The community gathering around warmth and music and story at the end of a working day. That pattern is very old, older than Scotland, but Scotland had brought a particular form of it across the water, and the mountains kept that form. The land itself was not empty when the settlers arrived. The hollows and ridges of Appalachia had been known and named and used for thousands of years. The Cherokee had settlements throughout the southern mountains. The Shawnee ranged further north. The Creek, the Catawba, these were nations with their own histories, their own songs, their own deep knowledge of the same rivers and ridges the settlers were learning. The encounters between Scots-Irish settlers and indigenous nations in the mountains were not a single story. Some were peaceful, trading relationships, a shared knowledge of plants and trails. Some were violent, with terrible losses on both sides. Some were shaped by political pressures that had nothing to do with the people in any given valley. The records are complicated, and honest history does not simplify them. What is worth saying clearly, the land was not empty. The settlers knew it was not empty. They moved into a landscape that had been shaped by human habitation for millennia, and those earlier inhabitants did not disappear. Their place names survived even where their communities were displaced. Their knowledge of the forest and the rivers was sometimes adopted by the settlers who followed them. The story is not cleanly one thing. Back to the music, which continues regardless. The modal fiddle tunes, the old ballads, the psalm singing. These things kept going in the mountain cabins through the 19th century and into the 20th, long after the wider culture had moved on to other things. The mountains were slow to change, and in this case, the slowness was a gift. The collectors who came in the early 20th century were not the first to notice. Local school teachers and ministers had known for decades that there was something unusual about the music and speech of their communities. They had written about it in letters and local newspapers. But the larger culture did not pay much attention until Sharp and his colleagues arrived with notebooks. Sharp was moved by what he heard. He wrote about it with a care that the people he was visiting recognized as genuine. He was not taking something from them. He was asking to write down what they already had. The singers and players who shared their songs with him were not performing for an audience. They were simply doing what they had always done in front of someone who happened to be paying very close attention. Maud Carpels continued the work after Sharp's death. She returned to the mountains in later years, and she found the tradition still alive, still being passed from parent to child in the old way. Some songs had shifted. Some were being sung by fewer people, but they were there. The thread had not broken. Today, those recordings and transcriptions are archived. Scholars can trace a song back from a recording made in Kentucky in 1955 to a manuscript collection in Edinburgh from 1700 and hear the family resemblance clearly. The same notes, the same story, the same emotional quality. 300 years and 3,000 miles have not broken the line. The words survived in the same way. Today you can find dictionaries of Appalachian dialect that read like a Scots dictionary with American spellings. The overlaps are not coincidence. They are documented inheritance, traceable through the known history of settlement, community by community, county by county, back to the ports of embarkation. And the storytelling is not entirely gone either. There are communities in the southern mountains where the tradition of spoken narrative, the long story by the fire, is still practiced and still valued. Not as a museum piece, as a living art. People who can hold a room for an hour with a story told without a note, the way their grandparents did and their grandparents before them. This chapter of the story has a particular quality of tenderness to it. The ballads and the fiddle tunes and the dialect words are not grand things. They are not buildings or inventions or institutions. They are small, private, domestic, the kind of things that do not appear in official records. They were carried in voices, not in luggage, and yet they survived when much that was heavier did not. What the emigrant women carried most of all was this: the songs. The men brought tools and seed and a knowledge of the land. But the songs were the women's cargo, and the songs were the ones that lasted. The mothers of Appalachian music were Scottish women who sang their children to sleep on ships and in cabins and beside fires that were different fires in a different country, but which served the same purpose. This is a sleep story, and that is the deepest connection here. The lullabies. In Scotland, the Oranage, the rowing songs turned cradle songs, the songs that matched their rhythm to the rise and fall of a breath. In the mountains, the same impulse produced the same kind of song, gentle, repetitive, calibrated to the pace at which a child crosses from waking into sleep. You may know one of them without knowing its origin. Hush Little Baby is American in its content, but Scots-Irish in its melody and its structure. Go to Sleep, Little Baby, the song that echoes through American folk tradition. It has cousins in Dumfriesshire and Antrim that share the same modal sadness, the same quality of a voice in the dark saying, "You are safe, I am here, rest now." The Highland Glen at dusk, the Appalachian hollow at dusk, the same sky, different continents, the same way that mist gathers wherever hills meet evening, a woman in each place singing something almost the same without knowing the other exists. The song doing what the song has always done, making the dark smaller. These are your people if you carry those names or that blood, or they are simply people worth knowing, the singers, the fiddlers, the storytellers, the women who kept the songs alive through crossings that might have extinguished them. Their voices are in the air of the mountains still. The mountains hold sound longer than you might think. Let the music quiet now. Let the fiddle lean against the wall. Let the fire settle. There is more to come in this story, more names and more chapters and more threads to follow, but not tonight, not yet. Tonight the ballad has reached its last verse, and the last verse is always quiet. A grave, a flower, the sound of water somewhere nearby, doing what water has always done, regardless of which side of the ocean it is on. Chapter 3: The Culture That Would Not Fade. Consider what it means to carry a culture with no state behind you, no government keeping the language alive, no institution paying the musicians, no official body deciding what was worth preserving and what could be set down. Only people, only habit, only the stubborn human preference for doing things the way your grandmother did them. The Scots in America had none of the usual supports. They were minorities, scattered across a continent, often outnumbered by their English and German and Dutch neighbors. The mechanisms that sustain a national culture, the courts, the academies, the publishing houses, the schools taught in the mother tongue, were not available to them. And still the culture persisted. The pipes arrived early and never really left. A Scottish immigrant carrying a set of bagpipes off a ship in 1740 would have seemed to his neighbors to be carrying the most impractical object imaginable. It needed constant attention. The reeds were sensitive to humidity. It carried across a settlement in a way that drew attention. None of this deterred anyone. The first documented pipe music in the American colonies appears in accounts from the mid-18th century. By the time of the Revolution, pipers were present at militia musters in the Carolinas and Virginia. They were playing for the same reasons they had always played, to mark the serious moments, the departures, the arrivals, the occasions when the ordinary world steps briefly aside. The pipe is not a gentle instrument. It is not meant to be. Its voice is designed for open country, for carrying over distance, for gathering people who are scattered. In the Highland tradition, it accompanies both celebration and grief. The communities that brought it to America understood this. They needed an instrument for both because their lives contained both in full measure. The fiddle worked differently. It came inside, to the fireside, to the small hours after the serious work of the day was done. The same tunes that had crossed the Atlantic in someone's memory settled into the hollows, and became something the children learned without being taught it. The fiddle tradition crossed generations that way, quietly, by sound rather than by instruction. What is remarkable is not that these musical traditions survived. It is that they survived in such recognizable form. The pipes played in an American mill town in 1850 were playing tunes that would have been recognized in Perthshire in 1750. The modal structures, the ornamentation, the rhythmic patterns, these were not fragments. They were the whole thing, still intact. The first Highland Games on American soil took place before the Revolution. The exact date is disputed, but the records suggest organized competitions of Scottish athletics, music, and dance existed in the colonies by the mid-18th century. They were not nostalgic events. They were what Scottish men did when they gathered. The tradition simply continued on new ground. These early gatherings were practical more than ceremonial. Men who worked with their bodies all week tested themselves against each other in ways that made sense to them. Strength, endurance, skill with a stone or a hammer. The caber toss, which is essentially the controlled management of an enormous piece of timber, would have made perfect sense to men who spent their weeks felling trees. The Highland Games that exist today across America, held from Georgia to Colorado, from New Hampshire to California, are the descendants of those early gatherings. The form has formalized over 2 centuries. There are piping competitions now, and Highland dancing judged by trained adjudicators, and clan tents with genealogy tables. But the core impulse is unchanged. Scots gathering together and doing Scottish things. After the Revolution, the pace of formal organization quickened. The St. Andrew's Society of Charleston was established in 1729, making it one of the oldest Scottish charitable societies in the Americas. It was founded to assist newly arrived Scottish immigrants in distress, to provide a safety net for people who had crossed an ocean and found themselves without resources in a strange city. Charleston's Scottish community was substantial and influential. Scottish merchants had been trading through the port since the early colonial period. They brought tobacco and indigo back to Glasgow markets and maintained dense commercial networks on both sides of the Atlantic. The St. Andrew's Society gave the community a formal shape, a name, a meeting place, a set of obligations to one another. The societies spread north and south. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, each city with a significant Scottish population eventually had one, and the pattern was consistent. Charitable work first, fellowship second, the keeping of Scottish custom third. They paid for passage home for Scots who had failed in America and could not afford to return. They funded medical care for members in difficulty. These were not sentimental organizations. They were practical ones. The men who founded and ran them were merchants and lawyers and physicians who understood that a community without mutual support was a community that would dissolve. The St. Andrew's Society was less a cultural club than an insurance mechanism, a way of ensuring that the Scottish community could hold together across generations. The Caledonian societies came later and with a somewhat different character. Where the St. Andrew's societies leaned toward charity and commerce, The Caledonian clubs emphasized the athletic and social traditions. They organized the games, sponsored the piping competitions, held the annual dinners. They were the institutions that made Scottish American identity a public and visible thing rather than a private family matter. San Francisco had a Caledonian club by 1866, which tells you something about the reach of Scottish emigration even by that early date. Gold Rush California had drawn Scots from across the world, men who had heard about the discovery and calculated, in the Scottish fashion, that the odds were worth the journey. Many of them stayed long after the gold was gone, and they built institutions. The Caledonian Club of San Francisco organized games at recreation grounds in the 1870s that drew competitors from across the Pacific coast. Scottish miners from Nevada, Scottish sailors from the port, Scottish merchants from the commercial district. The records describe crowds of several thousand. The hammer was thrown, the pipes played, the dancers performed. The distance from Scotland was 3,000 miles. The culture was present. Burns suppers deserve their own consideration. Robert Burns died in 1796 at 37 years old, already famous across Scotland and among the Scottish diaspora. Within a few years of his death, his friends in Ayrshire were holding an annual dinner in his memory, reading his poems, singing his songs, toasting his name. The practice spread with remarkable speed. By the 1820s, Burns suppers were being held in American cities with Scottish populations. By the 1840s and 1850s, they were happening in prairie towns where the nearest other Scot might live 20 miles away. By the end of the 19th century, Burns Night on the 25th of January was observed across the world wherever Scots had settled. The Burns supper on the prairie is a particular image worth holding. A farmhouse in Illinois or Iowa or Kansas, 1865. The winter dark outside. Inside, a handful of men and women, most of them born in Scotland or the children of those who were, sitting around a table with a haggis on it, which someone has made from a recipe kept in a notebook for 15 years. The address to a haggis is delivered, as it always is, with great seriousness and modest theatre. The whiskey is poured. The immortal memory is proposed, which is the formal toast to Burns himself, and usually an extended tribute to his work and his meaning. Then someone recites a poem. Then someone sings. The distance from Scotland is irrelevant. Burns is in the room. Burns gave the diaspora something valuable, a shared text. His poems were short enough to memorize and broad enough in subject to speak to almost every situation. They were in Scots, which was a language many of the emigrants and their children could still half understand, even when they had lost full fluency. He was the common reference point, the name that could be mentioned in any Scottish-American company and instantly understood. He was also, usefully, a democratic poet. Burns wrote about ordinary people, farmers, servants, field mice, drinking companions. He was not the poet of kings or of great public events. He was the poet of the particular human life in a particular place. That specificity resonated with communities that had left their particular places and were trying to keep the memory of them alive from a great distance. The Kirks held the communities together in a way that no secular institution quite could. A Presbyterian congregation in 18th century Virginia or Carolina was a Scottish community in miniature. The minister was often Edinburgh trained. The governance was familiar. Elders elected by the congregation, decisions made collectively, the minister accountable to the body of the people he served. For people who had left everything else behind, the church offered the specific comfort of unchanged form. The same psalms, the same manner of singing them, the same rhythm of the service, the same serious expectation that the sermon would be substantial and would reward attention. In a new and disorienting country, that consistency had a weight that went beyond theology. Scottish ministers in America tended to be formidably educated. Many had studied at Glasgow or Aberdeen or Edinburgh before emigrating. They brought libraries with them and started others. The link between the Scottish Kirk and the founding of American schools is not accidental. A congregation that believed in literacy as a spiritual duty built schools, and then built more schools and kept building them. The College of New Jersey, which became Princeton, was founded in 1746 largely by Scots-Irish Presbyterians who needed to train ministers for their expanding congregations. Log College in Pennsylvania, the forerunner of Princeton, was established by William Tennant, who had trained in Ireland and Scotland. The university system that America built in the 18th century has Scottish Presbyterian fingerprints throughout it. Dickinson College in Pennsylvania was chartered in 1783 and named for John Dickinson, but its first principal was Charles Nisbet, who came directly from Montrose in Scotland. Washington and Lee University in Virginia traces its early support to Scots-Irish Presbyterian communities in the Valley of Virginia. The pattern repeats. Wherever Scots settled in numbers, a school appeared within a generation. The colleges they founded were not finishing schools for the wealthy. They were training grounds for ministers and schoolmasters and lawyers who would serve communities spread across difficult country. They taught rhetoric and logic and moral philosophy alongside theology, because the Scottish tradition held that a minister who could not argue clearly was a minister who could not serve. Rigor was a form of respect. The tartan story in America is complicated and interesting. After Culloden, the British government banned Highland dress in Scotland itself for nearly 40 years. Ironically, the tartan survived more freely in the colonies, where no such ban applied. Scottish Americans wore their colours in mourning and celebration alike. By the time the ban was lifted at home, the American tradition was already established. The clan societies formalized what informal gathering had always maintained. The Clan Donald Society, the Clan MacLeod Society, the Clan Campbell Association, dozens of them across the country, keeping records of membership and lineage, organizing gatherings, maintaining the link with Scotland, not as museum pieces, as living organizations with genuine communities behind them. Weddings became a particular site of continuity. A Scottish-American family in the 19th century might have no Gaelic, no direct memory of the homeland, no knowledge of the exact glen their ancestors had left. But the wedding would still have a piper, still have a reel at the reception, still have someone at some point in the evening, making a toast that echoed the old country. The food preserved things that language sometimes forgot. The preference for oats in the morning, a habit so ingrained in Scottish-American families that it outlasted the memory of why it had started. Shortbread at Christmas, made from a recipe that had crossed the Atlantic in someone's memory and been written down, eventually, in a hand that had never held a pen in Scotland. Smoked fish, where the climate permitted. The taste for a very particular kind of plain, honest cooking that distrusted unnecessary elaboration and regarded a good piece of simply prepared meat as something close to a moral statement. This was not poverty. This was the application of a value system to what was on the table. The Scots had always believed that plainness was a form of honesty. The games and societies and churches and colleges were the visible structure. But the culture also lived in smaller things, in the way certain families talked to each other, in the dry humor that ran like a vein through the communities, in the particular quality of stubbornness that looked to outsiders like coldness, but was, inside the community, a recognized and respected trait. The humor was very specific, understated, self-deprecating, delivered without ceremony and with no signal that a joke was coming. The Scots in America did not lose this. It survived in the hollows of Appalachia, in the counting houses of Charleston, in the farmhouses of the Midwest. An ability to say a serious thing with a completely straight face and to recognize when someone else was doing the same. There is something worth sitting with here. These people had reasons to forget. Emigration had been painful. The clearances had been a wound. The ocean crossing had been brutal. Many of them had been pushed out of their homeland by forces they could not resist. And still they carried it with them, not because it was comfortable, because it was theirs. The culture survived because it answered needs that nothing else quite answered. The Burns supper answered the need for shared memory and shared text. The Highland Games answered the need for physical community and tested identity. The Kirk answered the need for continuity of form in a world that had changed everything else. The Caledonian Society answered the need for mutual support in an uncertain country. None of these institutions were designed by any central authority. There was no Ministry of Scottish Culture in Edinburgh deciding what should be preserved and how. The decisions were made locally by individual communities in Philadelphia and Charleston and San Francisco and small towns in between, each responding to its own conditions while drawing on a shared tradition. This is how culture actually survives without a state, not through official preservation but through use, not through museums but through practice. The Burns supper survived because people wanted to hold it. The Highland Games survived because people wanted to compete in them. The church survived because it gave people something they needed. The usefulness of a cultural practice is its best protection. By the middle of the 19th century, Scottish-American identity had developed its own distinct character. It was not simply Scottish culture transplanted. It was something new, shaped by the American landscape and the American experience, but recognizably rooted in Scotland. The American version of Burns Night was not quite the same as the one in Ayrshire. but they were unmistakably kin. The great wave of Highland emigration after the clearances brought fresh infusions of language and tradition. Communities in Cape Breton in Canada were so thoroughly Gaelic in the 19th century that the language stayed alive there long after it had retreated in Scotland itself. These communities in turn influenced the Scottish-American communities nearby, refreshing the connection through trade and family ties. The Gaelic language itself did not survive well in most of the United States. The practical pressures were too great. A child who spoke Gaelic at home had to function in English everywhere else, and English was the language of opportunity. Within 2 or 3 generations, most families had shifted entirely, but the traces remained in place names, in family words, in the cadence of certain phrases. The music was the most durable carrier. A culture can lose its language and keep its music. The tunes survived in Appalachia long after the words to many of the songs had faded. The modal scales, the specific ornaments, the rhythmic feel of the Scottish and Irish tradition, these persisted in the playing of fiddles in communities where no one could have told you which Scottish county the tunes had come from. The dance traditions survived with the music. The reels and jigs that had been danced on ship decks during the crossing and in barn raisings during the first years of settlement became American country dances that then diverged and blended with other traditions. The caller at an American square dance is doing something that would have been recognizable in a Scottish ceilidh hall, though the specific steps and patterns have changed. The community of practice is the unit of cultural survival, not the individual, not the family, but the gathering. The Burns supper requires a room of people. The Highland Games require a field and a crowd. The ceilidh requires musicians and dancers together. These forms of culture survived because they gave people reasons to gather, and the gathering itself refreshed the culture and passed it to the next generation. There is a quality to these surviving institutions that rewards attention. They are all, in their different ways, egalitarian. The Burns supper honors a ploughman's son. The Highland Games test physical ability, not social rank. The Presbyterian congregation, at its best, gives every member a voice in its governance. The culture that survived was the culture that had always insisted the ordinary person mattered. That insistence had deep roots. The Scottish Reformation had told ordinary people that they could read scripture for themselves. The clan tradition had said that a man's worth was known to his chief personally, not abstractly. The Burns tradition celebrated the common human experience. These were not identical values, but they pointed in the same direction. The person in front of you deserves to be taken seriously. The descendants of those emigrants still gather every January in rooms from Georgia to Oregon to raise a glass to a poet who died in poverty in Dumfries in 1796. They still gather every summer on fields across the continent to throw heavy things and play the pipes in the open air. They still build colleges and name them after Scottish ideas and fill them with the assumption that education is not a privilege but a duty. The culture that would not fade did not survive through sentiment alone. It survived because it was useful, because it gave people forms for the serious occasions, ways of marking the dead, ways of celebrating the new, ways of building community in places where community had to be assembled from nothing. A culture that knows how to do those things is a culture with a strong reason to persist. Tonight, let that be enough. The pipes are playing somewhere in America right now at a gathering on a college field or a festival ground, carrying across open air the way they were designed to, gathering in the scattered. The Burns supper table is being set in a farmhouse in the Midwest, the haggis made from memory, the whiskey poured with care. The Kirks are quiet at this hour, but they will open in the morning. The culture holds. It has always held. Chapter 12. The Long Memory. A family Bible is a particular kind of archive, not a public record, a private one, kept in a drawer or a chest, brought out at deaths and births and marriages, the names written in different hands across a century or more. Scottish-American families kept these Bibles carefully. The handwriting changes. The ink fades from brown to near invisible, but the names remain. Some of these Bibles are enormous. A family might have carried a heavy one across the Atlantic because it was the most irreplaceable thing they owned. Its weight was not an inconvenience. It was proof of the family's existence. Every name inside it said, these people were real, they lived, they mattered to someone who wrote them down. The names are the first thing. A great-great-grandmother called Morag, a name so specifically Scottish that it needs no explanation. A grandfather listed as born in Argyllshire, with a township name that no one in the family can any longer pronounce correctly. A note in the margin, in pencil, that says the old country, as if the writer assumed the reader would know which country was meant. Between the births and the deaths, small things were kept. A pressed flower, brown and flat, from a garden that no longer exists. A lock of hair folded inside a scrap of cloth. A receipt for a land purchase dated 1793, signed in a hand that does not match any of the names recorded inside. These objects do not explain themselves. They ask questions the family can no longer answer. The dates tell their own story. A last entry in Scotland, a first entry in America, and between them nothing, just the white margin of the page, which is the Atlantic crossing. You turn from one to the other, and you are traveling 3,000 miles in the turning of a leaf. The distance that consumed months of their lives takes a single second of yours. Sometimes a family kept two Bibles. The old one brought from Scotland or Ulster, its spine cracked and its pages nearly transparent with age. And a newer American one started fresh after the landing. The old Bible held the history. The new one held the future. Both Bibles sat in the same drawer, and the family sat between them. The clan societies came early. Scots in America did not wait for nostalgia to find them. They organized. The St. Andrew's Society of Charleston was founded in 1729, one of the oldest charitable organizations in continuous operation in the United States. Its founding members were merchants and ministers, men with clear memories of Scotland who wanted to maintain the connection and look after their own. The St. Andrew's Societies spread to city after city. Philadelphia, New York, Savannah, New Orleans. They raised funds for newly arrived Scots who had fallen ill or found themselves destitute. They organized the St. Andrew's Day dinner, held every year on the 30th of November. At that dinner, Men ate and toasted and sang, and for one evening the distance between Scotland and America narrowed. The Caledonian clubs followed, then the clan-specific societies, dozens of them, each carrying a name that connected its members to a particular branch of the Scottish tree. Clan Donald, oldest and largest. Clan MacLeod, Clan Campbell, Clan Graham, Clan Fraser. They corresponded with branches in Scotland, exchanged records, maintained genealogies that the founding families had begun, and their descendants continued. These societies were practical as well as sentimental. They kept records. They held archives. They knew who had come from where, and in what year, and on which ship. Long before any national genealogical service existed, the clan societies were preserving the documentation that would eventually allow descendants to trace their families back to a specific glen. A clan gathering is worth imagining, a field somewhere in the American South or the American West. Families arriving in cars from 5 or 6 states, people who have never met sharing a name and therefore, in some sense, a story. Tents and flags and the smell of wood smoke. A piper, a caber, children who find the whole business slightly embarrassing, and grandparents who do not. The records suggest many attendees feel something unexpected at these gatherings. They came expecting a pleasant social occasion. They find, alongside the social occasion, something they had not known they were missing. A sense of belonging that is not about the present company alone, something older. The name on the banner is not just their family name. It is the name of people who crossed an ocean to be here. For a long time, this was all many families had. The Bible, a few fragments of oral memory, a clan name that might connect to something in Scotland or might not. Genealogy, in the modern sense, was difficult. The records were in Scotland, and Scotland was far away, and the relevant archives were not always well organized or publicly available. The work of tracing a Scottish-American family line required patience of a particular kind. You wrote letters to churches in Scotland, and sometimes they replied, and sometimes the reply said the records from that period were lost, which they often were. Fire, flood, neglect, the ordinary attrition of centuries. You accepted that and moved to the next avenue. The Scots-Irish especially left patchy records, having passed through Ulster, and sometimes changed the spelling of their names along the way. Then, gradually, the records opened. Scottish parish registers became searchable. Land records and rent rolls went online. A family name in a Carolina courthouse could be traced to a rental record in Perthshire, and then to a baptism in a parish church that still stands, its stones green with lichen, in a glen that looks much as it looked 300 years ago. There is a particular kind of quiet-room emotion that genealogists know. You have been searching for hours. The screen is full of names that are not quite right, and then one is. The surname you are looking for, the parish you have been trying to find, the decade that fits. You sit very still for a moment. Something in your chest shifts, just slightly, as though a weight that had been balanced precariously has found a surface to rest on. The emotion is not easy to describe. It is not grief exactly, though grief is in it. It is not pride exactly, though pride is in it. It is something more like recognition, a name on a screen or a page that matches a name in a family Bible, and suddenly the distance collapses. The person who left becomes real, not a legend. A person who stood in a particular field in a particular year and made a decision. What you learn when you find them is often ordinary in the best possible way. A woman named Agnes, born in a township of 4 families on the eastern shore of Loch Fyne, baptized in the spring of 1741. Her father was a cotter. Her mother's maiden name was Campbell. She is not in any history book. She made no speech. She simply lived and left, and her leaving made you possible. Sometimes the record is a single line, a birth entry, a name, a date, a father's name in the margin. That is all. The whole person compressed into a clerk's notation made on a cold morning 3 centuries ago. And you stare at that single line and understand that you have been looking for this one line for months, and now that you have it, the single line is enough. The DNA services changed the scale of what was possible, not the emotion of it, which was already there for those who had been searching for years. But the scale. People who had never thought to look found themselves holding results that placed their ancestry in the Scottish Lowlands, in Galloway, in the Western Isles. Cousins appeared who had been looking from the other side of the same question. The connections the DNA results revealed were sometimes surprising. A family who believed themselves entirely Scots-Irish discovered a Highland line they had not known about. A family who thought their Scottish ancestry was 2 generations back found it was 6. The records had gaps. The DNA did not lie. It simply pointed at the deep past and said, "Here, this is where part of you comes from." The reunions that followed were quiet and strange and warm. Strangers with the same great-great-grandparents meeting for the first time in a car park in Edinburgh or a cafe in Inverness. Exchanging photographs, comparing notes, discovering that each had half a story and the other had the other half. These were not dramatic reunions. They were 2 halves of a conversation that had been interrupted for 150 years, resumed. Many of them travel to Scotland. They come every year in numbers that the genealogy industry on both sides of the Atlantic has learned to serve. They stand in graveyards reading stones. They walk into village archives and ask to see the old records. They hire guides who know the glens and can say, yes, this was the area, and there is the outline of what might have been a house. What they find is rarely dramatic. A ruined wall in a field, a name on a monument, a parish register entry in handwriting so old and cramped that a trained archivist has to help read it. And still people stand there in the soft Scottish rain, looking at these small and faded things, and feel something that is not easily put into words, but is absolutely real. The rain helps, oddly. It is a particular kind of Scottish rain, not a downpour, just a steady grey presence that makes the stones darker and the grass intensely green and the air smell of wet earth and something older. Visitors from California or Texas stand in it without complaining. Some of them find they do not want to move out of it. Something in the body recognizes it. The Highland Glen at dusk receives them quietly. The light here goes slowly, especially in summer. It does not switch off. It gentles down, the hills holding the last brightness long after the valley floor has gone to shadow. A person standing there from America, from North Carolina or Tennessee or Oregon, can feel the specific quality of that particular kind of quiet. It is the same quiet their ancestors felt. Whatever else changed, the light changed very little. The smell of peat and heather and the particular sharpness of mountain water, these were what the emigrants carried in their noses all their lives, in kitchens in Pennsylvania and on porches in Virginia, a sensory memory that no passage of time entirely erases. Some visitors walk to the site of the family township. These sites are not always marked. They are fields now or hillsides with nothing visible from a distance. The guide knows where to look. You cross a stile and walk through rough grass, and then you see it, a slight rise in the ground, a rectangle of stones just visible under the turf, a hollow where a doorway once was. You stand inside the outline of the house. The walls are 3 inches high and entirely covered in grass. It is not a ruin so much as a suggestion, a whisper of a building, and yet standing inside it, you understand the dimensions of the rooms, and you understand that the people who lived here did not live large. They lived small and close and particular in a way that made each object and each relationship matter. Some visitors find themselves counting the rooms. One main room, a small back room, space for 5 people, perhaps 6. The hearth would have been here in the center of the main room. The fire that never went entirely out, that was the warmth and the light and the company when the wind came off the hill. They stood inside that fire's heat for their whole lives. And then they crossed an ocean to stand in different heat entirely. The clan societies hold gatherings in Scotland too. Clan Donald at Armadale on Skye. Clan Campbell at Inveraray. Families who have not set foot in Scotland for 4 or 5 generations stand on ground that was once their family's ground and feel the weight of that, not oppressively, but fully. The way you feel the weight of something when you finally put it down and realize how long you have been carrying it. At Armadale, the MacDonald Museum holds records and portraits and artifacts. A visitor from Virginia or South Carolina might see a painting of a chief who shares their surname and feel a flicker of something, not ownership, not quite pride, but kinship in the oldest sense. That person looked like this. My name came from people who looked like this. The painting is not abstract. It is a relative. The homecomings are not always to famous places. Often they are to somewhere nobody has heard of. A village in Sutherland with 40 houses and a car park and a small church and a war memorial with names on it that match names in the family Bible back home. A valley in Perthshire that appears in no guidebook, but is the valley where a great-great-grandfather was born and where his bones are still in the ground. The genealogical researchers, the archivists, the village historians, these are quiet heroes in this story. The woman in a Perth library who spent 30 years indexing old records so that strangers could find their families. The volunteer in a Highland village who knows where every gravestone is and what the worn letters spell. They are the keepers of the connection, and they take the work seriously. The archivists describe people who weep reading a will from 1780. The document is dry and legal, a list of livestock and household goods distributed among children. But one of those children has the same name as a grandparent in an American family. That name in that will, in that year, in that place, is the link. The will is evidence. The weeping is recognition. Both are appropriate. Scotland has learned to welcome these homecomings with something more than tourism. The Ancestral Links Program, the National Genealogical Services, the clan centres, these were not built by accident. Scotland knows that millions of people around the world feel connected to it in ways that do not require a passport or a residence permit. The connection is older than any of those things. There is a word in Scots Gaelic that has no direct English equivalent, duchters. It means something like a hereditary connection to a place, a sense of belonging to land that belongs to you in return, not ownership in the legal sense, something older and less transactional than that. A relationship. The people who come back to Scotland from America are in some sense looking for their duchters, even if they have never heard the word. They find something, not everything they hoped for perhaps, because the land has changed and the communities have changed, and they themselves are Americans now, not Scots. But something, a thread that was never quite cut. A resonance between what they are and where their people came from that turns out to be real, not imagined, grounded in specific history rather than vague sentiment. That specificity matters. It is the difference between feeling generally romantic about Scotland and knowing that your great-great-grandmother was baptized in a particular stone church in Sutherland in a particular year, that her father was a cotter on a certain estate, that when the estate was cleared, she left not because she chose to, but because she was given no choice. The grief is real because the person is real. And the continuation is also real. She left. And here, 3 centuries later, her descendant stands in a hollow in Appalachia or a suburb of Boston or a valley in Oregon, and somewhere in their voice or their hands or their quiet stubbornness, there is something that is still hers. The long memory is not metaphor. It is transmission. Culture passed like a flame, hand to hand, through time. The oral tradition that carried the culture in Scotland never entirely vanished in America. A grandmother who knew songs in Gaelic and could not explain what the words meant, but sang them to her grandchildren anyway. A grandfather who said certain things a certain way, and when his grandchildren said the same things in the same way, they thought they were just speaking, not carrying anything forward. They were carrying everything forward. There are communities in America where the memory was kept most deliberately. The Gaelic-speaking settlements of Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, just across the border, maintained the language for longer than almost anywhere. Some families in the Carolinas kept Gaelic as a home language into the late 19th century. The language eventually yielded to English, but the cadences stayed in the speech patterns of people who had not heard a word of Gaelic in 2 generations. The physical objects that traveled with the emigrants became, in time, something more than objects. A spinning wheel that came from Argyll in 1743 and is still in a family in South Carolina, the wood dark with age, the mechanism no longer functional but the thing itself intact, occupying the same role the Bible occupies. Not a tool, a text, evidence of a life that was lived before this life. A Sgian dub, the small knife, passed down through generations of a Virginia family who had long since forgotten what the Gaelic words meant or what the original purpose of the knife had been. They kept it because it was old, and because their father's father's father had brought it, and because to give it away would be to sever something. They did not always know what that something was. they kept it anyway. The music kept itself most faithfully, because music does not need an institution to survive. It only needs one person who remembers and one person who is willing to listen. Fiddle tunes from the Scottish Highlands survived in Appalachian hollows through exactly that mechanism. One player teaching another, the tune passing between them like something handed across a stream, both hands extended, the water running between. A fiddle tune has no writer usually. It has a region, an era, a vague origin. It has hundreds of players who have each altered it slightly over generations, so that what exists now is a living thing, not a preserved one. The tune called Flowers of Edinburgh is 300 years old in some form. When an Appalachian fiddler plays a version of it tonight, they are in contact with something that was already old when their ancestors embarked. The songs that carried stories survived because the stories still mattered. Barbara Allen, which is a Scottish ballad in origin, is one of the most widely collected songs in American folk music history. It has been found in nearly every state. The plot does not change. A young man dies for love, and the woman who refused him regrets it too late. The song does not comfort. It witnesses. That is its function, and it fulfills it still. Across all of this, the two dusks return. The Highland glen at the end of a day. The Appalachian hollow at the end of a day. 3 centuries apart in historical time, 3,000 miles apart in physical distance, and yet connected by the same sky, the same slow way the light goes, the same human instinct to sit near a fire when the darkness begins to gather outside. Tonight, somewhere in the United States, a person opens a family Bible they have not opened in years. They are not looking for anything in particular. They are sorting through things, perhaps after a death in the family, clearing a house that held a lifetime. The Bible is at the bottom of a box. It smells of old paper and something else, something they cannot name, faintly sweet, the smell of another century. They open it, the front pages, the names, a handwriting they do not recognize, an ink that has gone the color of weak tea, a name that means nothing to them at first. And then, reading more carefully, a township name, a county in Scotland, a date. Their hand rests on the page. The house they are clearing is very quiet around them. They do not know yet what they will do with this. Perhaps nothing for now. Perhaps they will close the Bible and put it somewhere safe and live with the question for a while, the way you live with a question that is larger than your current capacity to answer it. Perhaps in a year or two, they will begin to look. Perhaps they will find the glen. Perhaps they will stand in the outline of the house in the field. Perhaps they will understand, standing there in the Scottish rain, that the people whose names are in the Bible were not strangers. They were the beginning of a chain that ends, for now, in them. And the glen will hold that understanding quietly, the way it holds everything, without comment, without ceremony, with the patience of something that has been holding things for a very long time. The long memory does not require tending every day. It keeps itself mostly in Bibles and names and songs and the shape of a person's hands. It waits. It is not impatient. It has already waited 3 centuries, and it will wait as long as it needs to. When you are ready to find it, it will still be there. That is the nature of what was carried. That is the nature of what holds. Let the history rest now. Let the names and the dates and the great movements of people settle quietly, the way a fire settles when you stop adding wood. The room does not go dark, it only gentles. The embers hold their warmth. This is how the night begins. We have come a long way tonight, from a weaver's cottage in Dunfermline to a mountain valley in the Sierra Nevada, from a harbour town on the Firth of Forth to a high Appalachian hollow where a fiddle leans against the wall, from the first ship out of Belfast Lock to a library in a small American town, its windows lit against the evening. Chapter 5, Bedtime Stories from Scottish America. This is the slow part, the part where the names and the movements of people give way to small, particular scenes, quiet rooms, lamplit tables, people at the end of a long day doing what people do when the work is finished, sitting still, thinking, resting. These scenes are not invented. They are assembled from what the records give us, from letters and journals and accounts, and the shapes that lives leave behind when they are finished. Where the records suggest, we follow. Where they fall silent, we let the silence speak. Andrew Carnegie, in the last years of his life, rises before the household each morning at Skibo Castle. It is a Highland habit. The castle stands in Sutherland, not far from country that was cleared of its people in the century before he was born. He built it knowing that. He planted trees. He dug a pool in the burn for his daily cold swim. He swims in it even in autumn, when the water is very cold. He comes out and dresses and walks back to the castle with his collar up. And for a moment he looks less like one of the richest men who ever lived, and more like a boy from a fife-weaving town who grew up cold and grew up fast and never quite forgot either. In the evenings at Skibo, Carnegie reads. The library at Skibo holds thousands of volumes. He built 2,509 public libraries before he built this one for himself. The parish school in Dunfermline had given him his first books when the family had none. He kept the debt in mind for 60 years and paid it in stone and shelving. He writes letters at the desk by the window, long letters to the directors of foundations, to presidents, to poets and scientists who interest him. The handwriting is careful. He learned it in a cotton mill, practicing on scraps by candlelight. The hand that guides the pen had guided a bobbin first, at $1.20 a week. Across America, at this same hour, the libraries he paid for are going quiet. A librarian in a small Ohio town straightens the last returned book and turns off the reading room lamp. A boy in Georgia has kept his borrowed volume past closing time and is reading it under a blanket at home, the spine held flat by a practiced thumb. Carnegie does not know about the boy in Georgia, but he built the building for him. He built it for the boy he himself had been, one who arrived at a door where books lived and felt something change inside him, some sense of limit dissolving. He said in later life that nothing he built was worth as much as the key someone had once given him to a private library. He gave 2,500 keys back. The lamp at Skibo dims. The Sutherland Hills hold the last light, the same way they held it in the century of the clearances, the same way they will hold it long after the castle has returned to grass. Carnegie closes his book. The fire settles. The night comes in from the north, quiet and enormous, as it always has over those particular hills. Now to a bay in Nova Scotia, and to a man who cannot stop thinking. Alexander Graham Bell's workshop at Baddeck is lit when the bay is dark. It is always lit when the bay is dark. His wife Mabel, who is deaf from childhood, has learned to know his particular quality of late-night attention by the lamplight shape of it. She was his student once in Boston when he was teaching deaf children to speak, and she was learning to navigate a hearing world. He fell in love with her mind before anything else, the way her thought moved, the questions she asked without hearing a word he said. She read lips and faces and the shape of his concentration. Bell is making sketches tonight, not of telephones. That work is many years behind him. He is thinking about the air, about how things fly. He has built kites here, enormous tetrahedral kites that rise off the bay in a way that astonishes the fishermen. The principles that interest him are older than any machine. How a surface holds itself in moving air. His father's visible speech, the system that mapped every sound the human mouth could make, began from the same impulse, a belief that if you could see the exact shape of a thing, you could understand it. Bell inherited the impulse and extended it. He spent his life making invisible things visible. Sound, flight, the structure of the voice. The bay outside is dark and still. The stars are reflected in it, doubled. Bell looks up from his papers and sees them and thinks, for a moment, of Edinburgh, of the street where he was born, of the windows of the house where his father first showed him the shapes that sounds make. He is a long way from South Charlotte Street. He is not entirely anywhere else. He will not go to bed for another hour, but he is slowing. The pencil moves less certainly. The sketches are becoming something closer to notes than diagrams. Mabel has left a lamp in the window of the house across the garden. He knows what it means. He begins to put his papers away. John Muir is not in a house tonight. He has not been in a house for 3 days. He is somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, in the high country, above the tree line at first, but now down among the sequoias, which are a different kind of altitude altogether. Not height from the ground, but depth into time. A sequoia that is 2,000 years old was already old when the first Scots were building their first stone houses in the glens. It was old when the clan system was forming. It was old when Columba crossed from Ireland to Iona and began the slow work of a faith. It stands here now, indifferent to all of that, still growing, still adding rings. Muir knew this when he stood among them. He wrote about it without mysticism and without false modesty, which was the Scottish way. He counted and measured and compared. He also felt things he could not count, and he wrote about those too, because a man who only measures and never feels is only doing half the work. He has made a bed of fir branches near the base of a tree. The night is cold but still. He has a blanket and he has been in colder places. He grew up on a Wisconsin farm that the family cleared by hand from raw forest. He knows what cold is. He pulls the blanket up and looks at the sky through the canopy and breathes the high country air. It smells of resin and cold rock, and very faintly, the creek he crossed an hour ago, which ran over granite in a way that sounded, if he let himself hear it that way, not entirely unlike the burns of East Lothian. He does not let himself hear it that way, but he does not entirely resist it either. The cold Scottish shore is still in his body somewhere. He is nearly asleep. The notebook is closed in his pack. Tomorrow he will write down what he saw today, the particulars, the species, the measurements, the quality of light at a specific hour. Tonight there is only the dark and the smell of the trees and the extraordinary patience of this particular place, which has been here since before anyone thought to give it a name. Now the scene changes, not a famous man's room tonight, but an ordinary one. A kitchen in western North Carolina, late evening, probably the 1890s. A woman sits at the table. The lamp is low. She is teaching her granddaughter a song. She does not read music. She never has. The song lives in her voice and in the voices of the women who came before her, back through generations of kitchens and fireside rooms to a place she has never seen and cannot quite imagine. A glen, a stone house, a woman spinning, singing the same song in a different country, in a different century, to a child who looked up with the same expression this child is wearing now. The granddaughter is learning the words. They are old words, older than anyone in this kitchen, a lord on a grey horse, a woman at the cliff's edge, a door that does not open in time. The story does not end well, but the song is not sad to hear. There is something in it that is larger than sad, a truthfulness that holds you steady. The grandmother sings a line. The child echoes it, not quite right, not yet. The grandmother sings it again, slower. The child tries again, this time closer. The grandmother nods and they move to the next line. No hurry, the night is long. The song will still be here when they are finished, and the night after, and the night after that. The record of this particular kitchen does not exist. We cannot say her name, but she was there, or someone very like her, in every hollow and cove and valley settlement from Virginia to Georgia to Tennessee. The songs were in those kitchens the way heat is in a hearthstone, absorbed over years, released slowly, warming the room without any drama. This is how the ballads survived, not in archives, not on a shelf, in a child who listened and remembered, and one day found herself in a kitchen of her own with a child looking up at her. Culture passed like that, hand to hand, voice to voice, along a chain of ordinary evenings that the history books do not bother to record. The lamp in the kitchen is turned down. The granddaughter goes to bed carrying the words in her mouth, moving them silently, testing the shape of them in the dark. A lord on a grey horse, a door that does not open. She will remember this song for the rest of her life. She will sing it to her own grandchildren. The chain holds. It is time to return to the image we began with. Hold it gently as you held it at the start. You have been carrying it all night. A highland glen at dusk. The heather going grey in the fading light. A burn running somewhere below, talking to itself in the old way over the same stones it has moved over since the ice retreated. Peat smoke rising from a low stone house, thin and fragrant in the cold air, visible against the darkening hillside for a long time before it dissolves. The light here goes slowly. It does not switch off. It gentles down. The hills hold the last brightness after the valley floor has gone to shadow. The sky above the ridge is still a pale gold in the west. A curlew calls once from somewhere up on the heather. Then silence, the particular highland silence that is not empty but full. On the other side of an ocean, an Appalachian hollow at dusk. Wood smoke rising from a cabin in the trees, thin as the highland smoke, the same motion in the air. The last light sitting on the ridge to the west, gold in the same way, going the same slow way. Mist beginning to gather in the lowest part of the hollow, the way mist always gathers where hills meet evening. A whippoorwill calls from the tree line. The creak in the bottom is audible now that the day sounds have stilled, running over its stones in its own quiet language. A fiddle leans against the wall inside the cabin. The fire has gone to coals. Someone is nearly asleep in a chair. You are between them, the same sky stretched over different continents, the same stars beginning to appear first in the east, then filling the dark from one horizon to the other. They do not know that one valley is in Scotland and one is in America. They have been looking down on both for longer than anyone can say. The people who carried Scotland across the ocean are resting now. Not the famous ones only, Carnegie in his Sutherland library, Bell with his kite sketches, Muir under his sequoias, all of them. The ones whose names are on buildings, and the ones whose names are only in family Bibles in a drawer somewhere, faded but still readable. The cotter who left a Highland glen with his few things and his many memories. The Ulster Scots woman who stood on the quay at Belfast Lock and did not look back because she could not bear to. The child born on the Atlantic who grew up knowing two worlds and being fully at home in neither and finding a third world in the mountains, all of them resting. They built things, they named things, they sang things. They insisted on schools when there was barely food. They built churches before they built barns, and then built barns because the animals needed shelter and the family needed feeding, and there was no end to the work, but they did the work anyway, season by season, year by year, generation by generation. They argued. They were stubborn in ways that frustrated people and also in ways that held communities together when softer people might have given ground. They kept the old songs not because they thought of themselves as keepers of tradition, but because the songs were true and the truth was worth keeping. The mountains preserved what they brought. The mountains were good at that. Where the Scots and Scots-Irish settled, they met peoples who were already there. The Cherokee in the southern Appalachians, the Shawnee, the Lenape, the many nations of the Ohio country. The land was not empty. It had names and histories and peoples with their own long memories, and that collision, which was often violent and always consequential, is part of this story too, held honestly in the night alongside everything else. The Scots who became Americans did not always reckon with that clearly. Some did, and the records show it. Others did not. What the honest history requires is simply this, that the land had a before, and that before matters, and that the people who were there before are still here, still carrying their own long memories, and their presence is not a footnote, but a foundation. We name this at the close because the story of how Scots built America is also the story of how a new country was made on ground that was not empty. Both things are true. Both deserve to rest with you tonight, quietly, without looking away. There is gratitude in this story if you are willing to feel it. Gratitude for the people who carried so much across so much water and did not lose what mattered. Gratitude for the names in the Bibles and the songs in the kitchens and the walls built without mortar and the schools built before anything else. Gratitude for the stubbornness, which was a form of love. If you carry a Scottish surname, the thread from tonight's story leads somewhere real. A field in Perthshire or Sutherland or Argyll. A stone in a churchyard with your family name on it, the letters worn soft by 3 centuries of rain. A child who stood there in that exact place and felt the ground under their feet and understood it as home, and then had to leave it. If you do not carry that name, you may still carry something from this story. The ballad in the mountain kitchen is everyone's now. The libraries are open to anyone. The national parks belong to whoever arrives at the trailhead with decent boots and the willingness to look. The gifts that Scots gave to America were not kept in the family. They were left on the table for the whole room. Carnegie's libraries are closing their doors for tonight. The last reader checks out the last book. The lights go out one by one across small towns from Pennsylvania to California, from North Carolina to Oregon. The rooms go dark. The books wait on their shelves, patient as they always are, ready for tomorrow. Bell's papers lie still on the Baddeck table. The bay outside holds its reflection of the stars. His kites are in the shed, furled and quiet, waiting for a wind. The question he was working on tonight will wait too. It is a very old question, and it is used to waiting. Muir breathes slowly under the sequoias. The creek runs in the dark below him. The tree above him has been standing for 2,000 years and is not concerned with what happens at its feet. The cold air moves through the high branches with the sound of something being read or sung just below the threshold of hearing. The Highland Glen is entirely dark now. The burn is still running, always running, the same as it was when the last family left and the same as it was before they arrived. The hills are exactly where they have always been. The curlew has settled somewhere in the heather. The stars are out. The Appalachian hollow is dark and still. The whippoorwill is quiet. The mist has settled in the lowest ground. The fiddle leans against the wall. Whoever was nearly asleep in the chair has found their way to bed. The coals in the hearth are very low now, orange at the edges, going grey at the center, holding their heat without any effort. The same stars are above both. They have been above both for as long as there has been sky. They will be above both when everything built tonight is returned to the ground. This is the oldest comfort there is, that the sky is the same sky and the dark is the same dark, and wherever your people came from and wherever you are now, the stars connect you to all of it. This is the third and final chapter of the story of the Scots who built America. If you have been with us for all 3 parts, you have traveled a long way. You have stood in Highland glens and lowland boroughs and Ulster townships and log cabins and mountain passes and steel mills and Sierra meadows. You have kept good company. Rest now. Good night from Tartan Lullaby. The glen is quiet. The hollow is still. The same stars look down on both, as they always have, as they always will. Sleep well. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.